Imagine a world where knowledge was guarded not by passwords or firewalls, but by monks' memory and manuscripts copied by hand. Imagine a place where thousands of students lived together, debating logic at dawn, studying medicine at noon, and discussing astronomy under oil lamps at night. This world existed, and then it burned. At the end of the 12th century, Eastern India was home to some of the most advanced intellectual institutions on Earth. Long before Oxford or Cambridge rose to prominence, places like Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Odantapuri functioned as international universities. Nalanda was not a single building. It was a vast complex of monasteries, lecture halls, libraries, dormitories, and gardens, supported by royal grants and local economies. It housed thousands of monks and scholars, many of whom came from China, Tibet, Korea, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia. Chinese pilgrims such as Xuanzang had written detailed accounts centuries earlier, describing a disciplined academic culture where entrance examinations were strict and failure was common. Only the most capable students were admitted. The libraries were legendary. They were known collectively as the Dharmaganja, the Treasury of Truth. Texts were stored in multi-story buildings. Some works existed nowhere else on Earth. These institutions did not belong to one king. They belonged to an idea that knowledge should be preserved, debated, and passed on. But by the late 1100s, this world stood at a crossroads. Political unity in northern India had weakened. Buddhism, once patronized by emperors, was already in decline. Royal protection had thinned, and new powers were rising along the northwestern frontier. Among them was the expanding force of the Ghurid Empire, whose generals pushed eastward into the Gangetic Plains. From this turbulent frontier emerged a figure who would leave a permanent scar on India's intellectual history. His name was Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khalji. He was not born into royalty. He was not a scholar nor a statesman. Persian chroniclers describe him as physically unimpressive, socially marginal, and initially rejected by established military elites. Denied status, Bakhtiyar relied on something else: speed, surprise, violence. Operating with small, mobile cavalry units, he specialized in sudden raids rather than prolonged sieges. He moved fast, struck unexpectedly, and disappeared before resistance could organize. When Bakhtiyar crossed into Bihar and Bengal, he entered a landscape filled with large monastic complexes, massive, fortified-looking structures surrounded by walls and storage facilities. To a raider's eye, these did not resemble places of learning. They resembled enemy strongholds. According to the Tibetan historian Taranatha, Bakhtiyar's forces attacked these monasteries, believing them to be military fortresses. Monks were killed, buildings were looted, libraries were set on fire. Taranatha writes that the fires burned for months. Later Persian sources, including Minhaj-i-Siraj, confirm that Bakhtiyar destroyed major Buddhist centers during his campaigns, though they do not dwell on the intellectual loss. What vanished was not just architecture. It was medical knowledge refined over centuries, philosophical debates that shaped Asian thought, mathematical and logical traditions transmitted across cultures. This was not a single moment of destruction. It was the collapse of an ecosystem. India did not lose its culture. India survived. But a chapter of human knowledge, painstakingly built over generations, was erased in days. And the man responsible did not pause to understand what he had destroyed, because to him knowledge was not sacred. It was just another obstacle on the road to power. In the next part, we will step away from the burning libraries and ask a harder question. Who was Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khalji, really? A religious zealot? An opportunist? Or simply a product of a violent age? To understand the destruction that followed, we must understand the man behind it. Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khalji did not begin his life destined for greatness. He did not inherit a throne. He did not command respect by lineage or scholarship. He emerged from the margins. Bakhtiyar belonged to the Khalji tribe, a Turkic group that had migrated into Afghanistan generations earlier. By the late 12th century, Khaljis occupied an uncertain social position. They were not fully accepted among the Persianized elite of the Ghurid Empire, nor were they rooted in the lands they served. This mattered. In medieval Islamic military culture, lineage and patronage determined advancement. Bakhtiyar lacked both. Persian chronicles describe him as physically unimpressive and socially awkward. Early in his career, he was rejected repeatedly by senior commanders who saw no value in him. For a man like Bakhtiyar, there were only two paths forward: obedience and obscurity, or violence and recognition. He chose the second. Bakhtiyar eventually found opportunity under Qutb al-Din Aybak, the Ghurid general who would later become the first Sultan of Delhi. Aybak needed aggressive men willing to operate on unstable frontiers, places too risky for conventional armies. Bakhtiyar was perfect for this role. Rather than commanding large forces, he led small cavalry units, often no more than a few hundred men. His strength was speed, his method was shock. He avoided pitched battles, and instead targeted vulnerable settlements, supply centers, and religious institutions that held wealth but little defense. This is crucial. Bakhtiyar was not conducting ideological warfare in the modern sense. He was not interested in theological debate or conversion. His campaigns were raids, not reforms. Eastern India, particularly Bihar and Bengal, was ideal terrain for this kind of warfare. The region was politically fragmented. Central authority had weakened after the decline of powerful dynasties like the Palace, who had once patronized Buddhism. Monasteries still stood. Students still studied, but royal protection had faded. To Bakhtiyar, these institutions represented three things: stored wealth, large populations, symbolic dominance. They were targets. Persian sources like Minhaj-i Siraj, Tabaqat-i Nasiri describe Bakhtiyar's campaigns as swift and devastating. He bypassed fortified cities and struck places that could not respond militarily. When his forces encountered massive monastery complexes, they likely assumed they were enemy garrisons. The size, walls, and organization of institutions like Nalanda and Vikramashila resembled fortified towns. Bakhtiyar did not investigate. He attacked. The Tibetan historian Taranatha, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier monastic traditions, describes monks being killed and libraries destroyed. While historians debate details, the convergence of multiple sources, Persian, Tibetan, and archaeological, confirms large-scale destruction. What followed was not just violence. It was abandonment. Surviving monks fled north into Tibet and Nepal, others scattered into rural areas. Without royal patronage, the remaining institutions collapsed slowly, unable to rebuild. Bakhtiyar did not remain in Bengal long. His ambition outpaced his capacity. After conquering Bengal, he attempted a reckless invasion of Tibet through the Himalayas, an expedition that ended in disaster. His army was decimated by terrain, climate, and resistance. He returned broken. Shortly afterward, Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khalji died, possibly assassinated by his own officers. His life ended as abruptly as it had risen. But the damage remained. He did not establish a lasting dynasty. He did not leave laws or monuments. He did not create a stable state. What he left behind was absence. In the next part, we will step back and examine the world Bakhtiyar shattered, not through conquest alone, but through the destruction of knowledge systems that had no immediate defenders, long before armies marched across eastern India, long before flames rose over monastery walls. This region was known not for war, but for learning. To understand the scale of what was lost, we must first understand what these institutions actually were. Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Odantapuri were not schools in the modern sense. They were self-contained intellectual cities. Each functioned as a living network of teachers, students, scribes, translators, physicians, and philosophers. Nalanda alone may have housed over 8,000 students and 500 teachers at its height. Entry was not guaranteed. According to Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, candidates were tested rigorously at the gates. Many were rejected before ever stepping inside. Once admitted, students followed structured curricula. They debated logic and metaphysics. They studied grammar, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and ethics. Buddhist philosophy was central, but not exclusive. These universities were global. Texts traveled from India to China and Tibet through these institutions. Sanskrit works were translated into Chinese. Tibetan monks studied Indian logic and carried it back across the Himalayas. In this way, Eastern India functioned as an intellectual engine for much of Asia. The libraries were the heart of this system. Nalanda's library complex, known as the Dharmaganja, or Treasury of Truth, consisted of multiple multi-story buildings. Texts were copied by hand, preserved carefully, and categorized. Some manuscripts represented centuries of accumulated scholarship. These were not easily replaced. Knowledge at this time did not exist in duplicates. There were no printing presses, no centralized archives elsewhere. When a manuscript burned, it was often lost forever. By the late 12th century, however, these universities were already vulnerable. Buddhism in India had been declining for generations. Hindu philosophical traditions had absorbed many of its ideas, while royal patronage shifted elsewhere. The once powerful Pala dynasty, which had protected and funded these institutions, had fallen. The universities still existed, but without strong political guardians. This made them uniquely exposed. They were wealthy, they were populated, and they were undefended. To a military commander like Bakhtiyar Khalji, operating in hostile territory with limited resources, such institutions appeared as strategic targets. When Bakhtiyar's cavalry struck, the universities could not resist. Monks were not soldiers. Walls were symbolic, not defensive. Tibetan sources described chaos, monks fleeing with texts strapped to their backs, attempting to preserve fragments of knowledge as buildings burned behind them. Some escaped northward. Others disappeared entirely. What followed was not immediate silence, but gradual collapse. Without teachers, students dispersed. Without libraries, curricula dissolved. Without patronage, buildings decayed. Within a generation, institutions that had shaped Asian thought for centuries were gone. This destruction did not end learning in India. It did not erase Indian culture, but it shifted the center of Buddhist scholarship permanently. Tibet, Nepal, and Southeast Asia inherited fragments of what India had once held in full. Indian Buddhism never fully recovered, and the loss went far beyond religion. Medical knowledge vanished. Philosophical debates ended mid-argument. Scientific traditions were interrupted. History remembers kings and battles easily, but it struggles to measure silence. In the next part, we will confront the most difficult question of all. Was this destruction intentional? Or was it the byproduct of ignorance, ambition, and political collapse? When civilizations collapse, history often searches for villains. But history is rarely that simple. To understand what happened in Eastern India at the end of the 12th century, we must ask a difficult and uncomfortable question. Did Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khalji deliberately target knowledge? Or did he destroy it without understanding what it was? The surviving sources do not give us an easy answer. Persian chronicles written by court historians, such as Minhaj-e-Siraj, do not describe Bakhtiyar as an ideological crusader. They portray him as a frontier commander rewarded for territorial expansion and plunder. His campaigns are framed as military success, not religious purification. This matters. There is no surviving decree ordering the destruction of Buddhist learning. No proclamation condemning philosophy or scholarship. No evidence of a planned campaign against education itself. What we see instead is something more dangerous: indifference. To Bakhtiyar and his men, monasteries were not universities. They were large, wealthy compounds. They held food, gold, labor, and land. In a medieval military context, such sites were legitimate targets. And yet, this does not absolve responsibility. Ignorance does not erase consequence. When Bakhtiyar's cavalry attacked monasteries, monks were killed, libraries were burned. Centuries of accumulated thought were erased, not because they were debated and rejected, but because they were misunderstood and expendable. This pattern is tragically familiar in history. The destruction of Alexandria's libraries, the burning of Mayan codices, the loss of Baghdad's House of Wisdom. In each case, knowledge fell not because it was refuted, but because power no longer valued it. There is another layer to consider. By the late 12th century, Buddhism in India lacked defenders. Unlike Hindu temples, which were embedded in local communities, Buddhist monasteries had grown increasingly centralized and elite. When royal patronage collapsed, their protection vanished. This made them politically isolated. Bakhtiyar did not face organized resistance. Local rulers did not intervene. The institutions stood alone. Violence thrives in such spaces. Yet it is also important to resist simplistic narratives of civilizational destruction. Islamic rule in India would later support learning, translation, astronomy, and medicine. Persian and Arabic scholarship would flourish in Delhi, Agra, and beyond. The tragedy here lies not in religion versus religion, but in timing, collapse, and opportunism. Bakhtiyar arrived at a moment when institutions were strong but unsupported. Knowledge was vast but vulnerable. Political unity was absent. He exploited that vacuum. And then he moved on. He did not stay to govern. He did not rebuild. He did not replace what he destroyed. That absence is as important as the violence itself, because knowledge does not recover automatically. In the next part, we will follow the aftermath, not in flames, but in silence. What happened to the surviving scholars? Where did the knowledge go? And how did Asia absorb what India lost? When the fires faded and the cavalry moved on, eastern India did not immediately fall silent. It emptied. Survivors did not gather to rebuild Nalanda or Vikramashila. There were no royal decrees promising restoration. No armies arrived to protect what remained. Instead, people left. Monks who survived the attacks fled in small groups, carrying what little they could save. Palm leaf manuscripts were bundled hastily, wrapped in cloth, and tied to backs. Some carried only fragments, single texts torn from larger collections. Others carried nothing at all, fleeing with memory alone. These scholars did not move south or west. Those regions were unstable and dangerous. Instead, they moved northward, toward the Himalayas. This migration would quietly reshape Asian history. Across mountain passes and trade routes, monks entered Nepal, Tibet, Bhutan, and beyond. Tibetan chronicles record waves of Indian scholars arriving during this period, teachers of logic, ritual, medicine, and philosophy. They were not refugees in the modern sense. They were carriers of a broken tradition. In Tibet, these scholars found something India no longer offered: patronage. Local rulers supported monasteries and valued Indian learning as authoritative. Sanskrit texts were translated into Tibetan. Oral traditions were recorded. Commentaries were preserved. Ironically, much of what we know today about Indian Buddhist philosophy survives outside India, reconstructed from Tibetan translations. This survival, however, came at a cost. Separated from their original cultural context, traditions became frozen. Debate continued, but innovation slowed. The dynamic intellectual ecosystem that Nalanda represented, where multiple schools argued side by side, could not be recreated fully elsewhere. Meanwhile, back in India, the monasteries deteriorated. Without teachers, students vanished. Without funding, buildings collapsed. Without texts, curricula dissolved. Within decades, sites that had once drawn scholars from across Asia became ruins. Local memory faded quickly. New generations grew up unaware that these places had once shaped global thought. This is how knowledge disappears, not with a single act of violence, but through abandonment. Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khalji did not chase the fleeing monks. He did not attempt to erase their memory beyond the moment of destruction. His ambitions lay elsewhere, yet his actions had created a rupture. India remained intellectually vibrant, but the center of Buddhist learning shifted permanently beyond its borders. This was not replacement. It was displacement. In the next part, we will widen the lens even further, examining how this moment altered the cultural map of South Asia, and how later histories remembered, distorted, or forgot what had been lost. History does not remember everything. It remembers what survives. It remembers what is written down. And it remembers what later generations choose not to forget. After the destruction of the great monasteries of eastern India, there was no single moment of reckoning, no grand funeral for lost knowledge, no official mourning for burned libraries. Instead, silence settled slowly. The universities disappeared from daily life long before they disappeared from memory. Within a generation, Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Odantapuri were no longer active institutions. Their ruins became landmarks rather than living centers. As new political powers consolidated control over northern India, priorities shifted. Administration, taxation, military defense, and religious governance replaced philosophical debate and scholastic exchange. This was not unique to India. Every major political transition reshapes what a society values. The problem was not that knowledge ceased to exist. The problem was that its institutional memory collapsed. Without scholars to teach, there were no students to remember. Without texts to copy, there were no arguments to continue. Without patronage, there was no incentive to preserve ruins. As centuries passed, the story of what had been lost became fragmented. Persian chroniclers writing under later sultanates mentioned Bakhtiyar Khalji only briefly, usually as a successful conqueror of Bengal. The destruction of monasteries was not emphasized. It was not considered historically important within that narrative framework. Indian sources, meanwhile, were scarce. Buddhist institutions that might have recorded the trauma no longer existed. Hindu traditions had little reason to document the fall of Buddhist universities that had already declined socially. This created a historical vacuum. Into that vacuum entered myth. Over time, the story became simplified. Some portrayed Bakhtiyar as a religious fanatic. Others erased the destruction entirely. Some blamed abstract forces, decline, decay, inevitability. None of these explanations fully captured the truth. Modern historians had to reconstruct events indirectly through archaeology, Tibetan monastic records, Chinese pilgrim accounts preserved abroad, and Persian administrative histories. Only by cross-referencing these sources did a clearer picture emerge. Not a single act, but a sequence. Not deliberate cultural annihilation, but destructive opportunism. Not total erasure, but irreversible disruption. The most unsettling realization is this: civilizations do not always fall because they are defeated. Sometimes they fall because no one is left to defend what matters. The memory of Nalanda survived not because India preserved it, but because others carried pieces away. And this raises an uncomfortable question for every generation. What knowledge exists today that depends entirely on fragile systems? What libraries, databases, or traditions could vanish if abandoned? The story of Bakhtiyar Khalji is not only about conquest. It is about how easily memory can be lost. In the next part, we will examine the wider consequences, how this moment reshaped South Asia's intellectual balance and altered the trajectory of global knowledge. When libraries disappear, the loss is not immediate. The world continues. Empires rise and fall. Children are born. Trade flows. Religion adapts. But something subtle changes. The destruction of eastern India's great universities did not end learning in the subcontinent, but it redirected the flow of intellectual history in ways that are still felt today. For centuries before Bakhtiyar Khalji's invasion, India had functioned as a net exporter of knowledge. Philosophical systems, medical practices, astronomical calculations, and logical frameworks traveled outward to China, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. After the collapse of Nalanda and its sister institutions, that outward flow slowed dramatically. India did not become intellectually barren, but it became regionally focused rather than globally central. Buddhist scholastic leadership shifted northward. Tibet became the primary guardian of Indian Buddhist philosophy. Chinese traditions developed independently of their Indian roots. Southeast Asia adapted fragments into localized systems. What was lost was conversation. Nalanda had been unique not only for what it taught, but for how it functioned. It was a space where multiple schools argued openly, where disagreement was institutionalized, where learning was dynamic rather than devotional. That model vanished. In its place emerged smaller, isolated traditions, capable of preservation, but not expansion. The loss extended beyond religion. Indian medical texts, referenced in later Islamic and European sources, often appear incomplete, missing theoretical foundations that likely once existed. Mathematical ideas arrived in the Islamic world fragmented, without the full philosophical contexts that had originally shaped them. Logic systems that influenced Asian thought survived in Tibetan translation, but disappeared in their original form. The world did not know what it was missing, because it never saw it. Bakhtiyar Khalji did not intend to reshape global intellectual history. But power does not need intention to leave consequences. His invasion occurred at a moment when knowledge was centralized, protection had weakened, political unity was absent. History rarely offers second chances at such moments. By the time later rulers valued scholarship again, the institutions were already dust. Modern archaeology would eventually uncover Nalanda's ruins, brick foundations, collapsed walls, traces of dormitories and libraries. But archaeology cannot recover thought. It cannot reconstruct debates that never finished. It cannot restore questions that were never answered. This is the true tragedy. Not that knowledge was defeated, but that it was interrupted. In the final part, we will step back and ask the most difficult question of all. How should history remember Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khalji? As a destroyer? As a product of his age? Or as a warning about what happens when power outruns understanding? History often demands simple judgments. Heroes, villains, right, wrong. But the past rarely cooperates. Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khalji does not fit easily into any single category. He was not a philosopher king. He was not a religious reformer. He was not a long-term ruler who shaped institutions or laws. He was a man of motion, rising quickly, striking suddenly, disappearing just as fast. And yet, the consequences of his actions were permanent. Bakhtiyar did not set out to destroy Indian culture. India endured long after him. Languages, religions, arts, and sciences continued to evolve. But what he did destroy, whether intentionally or not, was an infrastructure of knowledge that had taken centuries to build. This distinction matters. Civilizations survive conquest. Knowledge systems do not always survive neglect. The universities of Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Odantapuri were not symbols of political power. They were symbols of continuity. Their strength came not from armies, but from memory. Teachers passing ideas to students, generation after generation. When that chain broke, it could not simply be repaired. Bakhtiyar Khalji operated within the logic of his time. Frontier warfare rewarded speed and plunder. Unprotected institutions were fair targets. Success was measured in territory, not preservation. But history is not obligated to judge by medieval standards alone. From a modern perspective, what was lost cannot be ignored. When libraries burn, humanity loses options. When debates end unfinished, progress slows. When knowledge is displaced rather than refuted, silence replaces understanding. Bakhtiyar himself did not benefit from what he destroyed. He died without legacy, without dynasty, without stability. His name survives not because of what he built, but because of what vanished during his brief rise. This is the uncomfortable truth history leaves us with. The most devastating actions are not always driven by hatred. Sometimes they are driven by ambition combined with indifference. The story of Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khalji is not only about one man. It is about a moment when learning stood unguarded, when institutions depended on memory rather than protection, when power arrived faster than understanding. As you reflect on this story, imagine Nalanda not as ruins but as it once was. Courtyards filled with voices, lamp-lit halls of debate, students arguing late into the night, libraries breathing with thought. Now imagine the silence that followed. History did not scream. It whispered, and then it moved on. This has been silent history, not to condemn, not to glorify, but to remember what silence erased. When conquest ends, something more difficult begins. Administration, memory, rebuilding. After Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khalji seized Bengal, the region did not descend into immediate chaos. Markets reopened, agriculture continued, taxes were collected. New rulers settled into old cities. From the outside, life appeared to move forward. But beneath that surface was an absence that would shape generations. The teachers were gone. The monasteries that had once anchored intellectual life in Bihar and Bengal stood empty or in ruins. Some had been destroyed outright. Others were abandoned slowly, stripped of resources, their courtyards overtaken by weeds and silence. There were no replacement institutions. The new ruling elite had little interest in preserving Buddhist scholarship. Their priorities were governance, revenue, and military security. Education, when it existed, shifted toward mosque-based instruction and court-sponsored learning in Persian and Arabic traditions. This was not inherently destructive, but it was discontinuous. The old system had collapsed without transition. Local populations adapted quickly. Farmers returned to fields. Craftsmen found new patrons. Religion adjusted to new power structures. But intellectual lineages, those delicate chains that require mentorship and continuity, did not survive disruption so easily. Bengal, once a destination for scholars, became a periphery. Not because its people lacked intelligence or creativity, but because institutions had vanished. This is how cultural loss often manifests, not as trauma, but as normalization. Children born after the invasions never knew Nalanda, never heard debates echo through lecture halls, never imagined libraries as living places. For them, this absence was simply the world. And history moved on. When we speak of loss, it is easy to imagine total erasure. But history is rarely absolute. Even as monasteries burned and scholars fled, not everything disappeared. Some knowledge survived, not because it was protected, but because it was already moving. Long before Bakhtiyar Khalji's raids, Indian scholarship had traveled far beyond the subcontinent. Centuries of exchange had carried ideas along trade routes, pilgrimage paths, and diplomatic missions. By the time Nalanda fell, its influence was already scattered across Asia. Tibetan monasteries preserved Sanskrit logic and metaphysics through translation. Chinese Buddhist canons contained Indian commentaries copied generations earlier. Nepalese scribes maintained ritual texts that no longer existed in their original form. These fragments became lifelines. Tibetan historians record the arrival of Indian scholars fleeing the Gangetic Plains, men trained in debate, grammar, medicine, and ritual. Some became teachers in new monasteries. Others trained translators who worked to preserve texts before memory faded. This preservation was imperfect. Translation changes meaning. Context is lost. Debates freeze mid-argument. But survival is never neat. Ironically, much of what modern scholars know about Indian Buddhist philosophy comes from Tibetan translations of lost Sanskrit originals. In some cases, the original Indian text is gone, but the Tibetan version remains. This reversal is extraordinary. India, once the source, became dependent on external archives to reconstruct its own intellectual past. Some Hindu philosophical traditions also absorbed fragments of Buddhist logic, ethics, and metaphysics. Over time, these ideas were reinterpreted and re-embedded within new frameworks. Islamic scholars arriving later encountered Indian mathematical and astronomical knowledge, not as living traditions, but as inherited fragments. Some were translated into Persian and Arabic, influencing the wider medieval world. So knowledge survived, but without its home. The universities that had nurtured debate, correction, and evolution no longer existed. What remained were echoes, valuable, influential, but incomplete. This is the quiet tragedy. Not extinction, but displacement. In the next part, we will compare this moment with other great collapses of knowledge, asking whether this pattern is unique or part of a recurring human failure. Nalanda was not alone. Across history, humanity has built places where knowledge gathered, grew, and was preserved, and then watched those places vanish. The destruction of Eastern India's universities belongs to a tragic pattern that repeats across civilizations. Centuries before Bakhtiyar Khalji rode into Bihar, the ancient world had already witnessed another devastating loss: the Library of Alexandria. Founded in the Hellenistic age, Alexandria's library aimed to collect all human knowledge. Scrolls arrived from across the Mediterranean. Scholars debated astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. Like Nalanda, Alexandria was not just a building, it was a system. And like Nalanda, its end was not a single moment. Wars, neglect, political change. Knowledge dispersed, then disappeared. Later, in 1258, another catastrophe echoed the same pattern: the destruction of Baghdad's House of Wisdom during the Mongol invasion. Persian and Arabic sources describe libraries emptied into the Tigris River, ink darkening the water. Baghdad had been the intellectual heart of the Islamic Golden Age. Astronomy, algebra, medicine, and philosophy thrived there. And then it collapsed. In each case, Alexandria, Baghdad, Nalanda, the causes differed. The actors changed. The religions involved varied. But the pattern remained the same. Knowledge systems were centralized, dependent on patronage, vulnerable to political disruption. When power shifted, learning suffered. What is striking is not how often libraries were destroyed, but how rarely they were defended. Armies protected cities. Walls protected wealth. But ideas were assumed to be immortal. They were not. Bakhtiyar Khalji did not need to hate learning to destroy it, just as Roman generals did not need to hate Greek philosophy to weaken Alexandria, and Mongol commanders did not need to despise science to devastate Baghdad. The lesson is sobering. Knowledge survives only when societies actively protect it. When institutions rely on tradition alone, they become fragile. Nalanda's fall reminds us that civilization's greatest achievements are not self-sustaining. They require guardians, political, social, and cultural. In the next part, we will confront a misconception that often distorts this history: the idea that faith itself destroys knowledge. When the story of Nalanda's destruction is told, it is often reduced to a dangerous simplification. Religion versus knowledge. Faith versus reason. Islam versus learning. This binary is tempting. It is also historically wrong. To understand what happened in Eastern India, we must separate actions of individuals from civilizations as a whole. Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khalji did not represent the totality of Islamic thought, just as the fall of Nalanda did not represent the end of Indian intellectual life. History demands precision. Islamic civilization, both before and after Bakhtiyar's time, produced some of the most sophisticated centers of learning the world has known. Cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, and Samarkand hosted scholars who translated Greek, Persian, Indian, and Roman texts. Algebra, optics, medicine, and astronomy flourished under Islamic patronage. These achievements are undeniable. So how do we reconcile this with the destruction of Buddhist universities in India? The answer lies not in ideology, but in context. Bakhtiyar Khalji was not a scholar king. He was not acting under a grand intellectual vision. He was a frontier commander rewarded for conquest. His actions reflected the priorities of frontier warfare, not the values of Islamic scholarship. In fact, many Islamic rulers actively supported learning, translation, and debate when stability allowed. But Bakhtiyar's campaigns occurred in a zone of instability, where speed and plunder mattered more than preservation. This distinction is critical. History is shaped less by belief systems than by power structures. When institutions of learning align with power, they thrive. When they lose protection, they become vulnerable, regardless of religion. Nalanda fell not because it was Buddhist, but because it was wealthy, symbolically important, politically isolated. Similarly, Islamic centers of learning would later fall under Mongol invasions, not because Mongols hated science, but because conquest does not prioritize preservation. The tragedy of Nalanda is not a clash of faiths. It is a warning about what happens when knowledge depends on fragile patronage instead of resilient systems. Reducing this story to religious blame obscures the deeper lesson and risks repeating the same mistakes. In the next part, we will examine a harder truth: why societies consistently fail to protect knowledge, even when they claim to value it. If history teaches us anything, it is this: humanity celebrates knowledge, but rarely protects it. We build libraries. We praise scholars. We quote philosophers. We admire wisdom in hindsight. But when power shifts, learning is often left exposed. Nalanda's destruction was not inevitable. It was the result of neglect layered upon ambition. For centuries, Indian rulers had supported monastic universities through land grants and royal patronage. But over time, political priorities changed. Military defense became more urgent. Court politics grew more complex. Religious institutions that did not serve immediate power lost influence. The universities continued to exist, but without shields. Knowledge institutions rely on three things: protection, continuity, relevance to power. Remove any one of these, and survival becomes uncertain. Nalanda lost all three. By the late 12th century, it was wealthy but undefended, respected but politically irrelevant, globally admired but locally vulnerable. Bakhtiyar Khalji did not destroy it because it was powerful. He destroyed it because it was unprotected. This pattern repeats across history. Libraries are not fortified. Archives do not march. Scholars do not carry weapons. When conflict erupts, knowledge is assumed to be passive, something that will survive on its own. It does not. The irony is cruel. Societies that depend most on accumulated knowledge often protect it the least. Kings protect borders. States protect treasuries. Empires protect legitimacy. But learning requires foresight, and foresight is rare in moments of instability. Even today, the same neglect persists. Digital archives are centralized. Research depends on funding cycles. Languages disappear without record. Entire cultures vanish with no documentation. Nalanda's fall is not a medieval anomaly. It is a warning. The destruction of knowledge does not always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from indifference. In the next part, we will turn to the ground itself, to archaeology, and ask what the ruins can still tell us centuries later. For centuries, Nalanda existed only as a name. Travelers passed over the plains of Bihar, unaware that, beneath their feet, lay the remains of one of the ancient world's greatest intellectual centers. Local villagers reused bricks from collapsed walls. Fields grew where lecture halls once stood. History slept underground. It was not until the 19th century that Nalanda began to re-emerge, not through memory, but through archaeology. British surveyors, followed later by Indian archaeologists, uncovered rows of red brick foundations stretching across the landscape. What they found was not a single building, but an entire city of learning. Monastic dormitories lined long corridors. Lecture halls opened into courtyards. Stupas rose in layered complexity, and most striking of all, there were signs of sudden destruction. Burn layers appeared in multiple structures. Charred brick, collapsed roofs, ash embedded deep into the soil. This was not slow decay, this was abrupt. Archaeologists did not find weapons or battle formations. They found silence. There were no rebuilt layers above the destruction. No evidence of restoration. No signs that the institution recovered. The ruins matched historical accounts that spoke of a catastrophic break rather than gradual decline. Excavations at Vikramashila and Odantapuri told similar stories. Large monastic complexes, burnt debris, abandonment. These sites were not destroyed by time. They were destroyed by events, and then forgotten. Perhaps most haunting is what archaeology did not find. There were no libraries preserved, no manuscript caches buried for safekeeping, no emergency storage rooms. Texts were likely stored in wooden shelves and palm leaf bundles, materials that burn easily and leave little trace. Once destroyed, they vanished completely. Archaeology can tell us how buildings fell. It cannot tell us what ideas burned. Every uncovered brick is a reminder. Civilizations leave monuments. Knowledge leaves shadows. In the next part, we move forward in time to the modern rediscovery of Nalanda and how the world slowly realized what had been lost. When Nalanda resurfaced in the modern era, it did not do so with noise. There were no surviving books to read, no teachers to interview, no traditions still alive on site. There were only ruins. As archaeological excavations progressed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, scholars began to realize the scale of what they were uncovering. This was not a monastery in isolation. It was an entire educational ecosystem stretching over kilometers. Long rows of identical monastic cells suggested residential learning. Large halls indicated structured debate. Complex drainage systems hinted at long-term habitation. Careful brickwork showed planning, not improvisation. Slowly, historians connected the physical evidence with textual sources. Chinese pilgrim accounts by Xuanzang and Yi Jing, once considered exaggerated, suddenly made sense. The scale described in their writings matched the ruins on the ground. Nalanda had not been symbolic. It had been massive. Yet the rediscovery was bittersweet. Archaeologists could map walls. They could measure courtyards. They could date destruction layers. But they could not recover content. What was missing could never be excavated. Palm leaf manuscripts do not survive fire. Ideas leave no fossil record. Debates do not leave footprints. As India moved toward independence in the 20th century, Nalanda became a symbol, not just of loss, but of historical depth. It represented an India that had once been globally connected through learning rather than empire. In recent decades, attempts have been made to revive Nalanda as a modern university. This effort is symbolic rather than restorative. No modern institution can replace what was lost, but it can acknowledge it. The rediscovery of Nalanda forced historians to confront uncomfortable questions. Why was this history forgotten for so long? Why was its loss not mourned earlier? And how many other centers of knowledge vanished without trace? Nalanda's ruins remind us that civilizations do not always fall loudly. Sometimes they fade quietly until someone starts digging. In the next part, we will explore how colonial narratives, nationalism, and modern politics reshaped the way this story was told, and sometimes misused. When Nalanda re-entered historical consciousness, it did not arrive in a neutral world. The rediscovery happened during the colonial period, when history itself had become a political tool. British scholars, administrators, and historians were not simply studying India's past. They were interpreting it through imperial lenses. For some colonial writers, the destruction of Nalanda served a convenient narrative. It suggested that India's decline was inevitable, that internal weakness had always plagued the subcontinent, that foreign rule, first Islamic, then British, was a natural outcome of disorder. In this framing, Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khalji became less a historical figure and more a symbol, proof that Indian civilization could not protect its own achievements. This interpretation ignored complexity. It erased centuries of resilience, adaptation, and cultural continuity. It reduced vast historical processes to isolated acts of violence. And it subtly positioned colonial rule as a corrective rather than another disruption. After independence, the narrative shifted again. Nationalist histories emphasized Nalanda as evidence of a glorious ancient India, often contrasting it sharply with later periods of foreign rule. In some retellings, Bakhtiyar Khalji became a one-dimensional villain stripped of context and nuance. This too carried risks. Simplification can become distortion. Memory can become weaponized. When history is reduced to slogans, it loses its explanatory power. The story of Nalanda does not belong to one ideology. It is not a justification for empire, nor is it a license for resentment. It is a case study in vulnerability. Bakhtiyar Khalji's invasion mattered, but so did the political fragmentation that preceded it. So did the loss of patronage. So did the absence of defenders when knowledge needed protection most. Colonial narratives often ignored these factors. Nationalist narratives sometimes overcorrected. True understanding lies between them. History should not exist to inflame. It should exist to illuminate. In the next part, we will step away from political narratives and ask a more universal question, one that applies beyond India, beyond medieval warfare, and even beyond history. What does Nalanda teach us about our own time? Nalanda did not fall because knowledge was weak. It fell because the systems protecting knowledge were fragile. This distinction matters more than ever. The scholars of Nalanda were among the most educated people of their time. Their debates shaped entire philosophical traditions. Their medical texts influenced healing practices across Asia. Their logic systems trained minds for generations. But intelligence alone could not save them. Knowledge does not defend itself. It depends on structures, political, economic, cultural, that must be maintained deliberately. Nalanda relied on royal patronage. When dynasties changed, funding weakened. When borders shifted, protection vanished. When instability grew, learning became expendable. The scholars continued teaching as if the world around them would remain stable. History shows us that stability is never guaranteed. This lesson echoes across time. The Library of Alexandria relied on imperial support. The House of Wisdom relied on caliphal protection. Nalanda relied on dynastic continuity. When those systems fractured, knowledge suffered first. In the modern world, we like to believe we are immune to such losses. We store data digitally. We back up archives. We replicate information endlessly. But our systems are not invulnerable. They are centralized. They depend on electricity, infrastructure, funding, and political will. Entire digital archives can disappear with policy changes. Languages vanish when speakers are lost. Research collapses when institutions lose support. The collapse may not look like fire. It may look like neglect, defunding, deprioritization, silence. Nalanda reminds us that the greatest threat to knowledge is not opposition, but assumption. The assumption that learning will always be valued, that archives will always be maintained, that someone else will protect what matters. No civilization has ever lost knowledge because it lacked brilliance. It lost knowledge because it failed to guard it. In the next part, we will confront a difficult question. Could something like Nalanda happen again, not in form, but in consequence? It is tempting to believe that Nalanda belongs safely to the past, that its destruction was the result of medieval warfare, primitive politics, and fragile institutions that no longer resemble our own. But history rarely repeats itself in the same form. It repeats in pattern. Nalanda fell because it existed at the intersection of three risks: centralized knowledge, political instability, assumed protection. Those risks still exist. Today, much of the world's knowledge is stored digitally on servers owned by governments, corporations, and institutions whose priorities can change rapidly. Research depends on funding cycles. Archives depend on maintenance. Languages depend on living communities. None of these are guaranteed. Modern conflicts have already shown how quickly knowledge can vanish. Museums looted, libraries burned, universities abandoned, scholars displaced. The loss is often invisible at first. Life continues. News cycles move on. Only later does the absence become clear, when questions can no longer be answered, when records are missing, when expertise has vanished. Nalanda did not fall in a single day. It faded after a rupture. The damage became permanent only because no one rebuilt the system. The lesson is not fear, it is vigilance. Knowledge must be distributed. Institutions must be resilient. Archives must exist beyond single points of failure. History does not punish arrogance. It punishes complacency. In the next part, we return to the man whose name remains tied to this moment, not to condemn or excuse, but to place him correctly within history. History often turns individuals into symbols. Over time, names become shorthand for events far larger than any single life. Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khalji is one such name. He did not plan the collapse of Indian Buddhist scholarship. He did not design a campaign against universities. He did not understand the global consequences of his actions. And yet, his name remains attached to them. Bakhtiyar was a man shaped by his environment, a frontier commander operating in an age where conquest was the primary currency of survival. He rose through audacity rather than institution building, through raids rather than governance. His career was brief, his power unstable, his end unremarkable. After his failed expedition into Tibet, Bakhtiyar returned weakened, possibly ill, possibly wounded. Persian sources suggest he was assassinated by his own officers, men who had once followed him out of fear or ambition. He left no dynasty, no lasting administrative system, no intellectual legacy. What he left behind was absence. The monasteries he destroyed were not replaced. The scholars he displaced did not return. The libraries he burned were never rebuilt. This is the paradox of his historical footprint. Bakhtiyar mattered not because he was great, but because his actions intersected with vulnerability. Had Nalanda been protected, he would have been a footnote. Had the monasteries been fortified, he would have moved on. Had political unity existed, destruction might have been limited. Instead, timing elevated him. History does not always turn on extraordinary people. Sometimes it turns on ordinary ambition, meeting extraordinary neglect. Bakhtiyar Khalji reminds us that damage does not require genius, only opportunity. In the final part, we will step back one last time, not to judge the past, but to ask what it demands of the present. History does not end with ruins. It ends with questions. The story of Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Odantapuri is not preserved because their libraries survived. It is preserved because fragments escaped, because memory crossed borders when buildings could not. What remains today is not the full record of what was known, but the outline of what was lost. And that outline is enough to trouble us. Muhammad Bakhtiyar Khalji did not erase India's culture. India endured. Ideas adapted. Civilization continued. But a moment passed, quietly, irreversibly, when humanity lost options. Entire debates ended unfinished. Entire disciplines vanished without successors. Entire methods of thinking disappeared without critique or replacement. This is the true cost of silence. History often focuses on what replaces what. Empires replacing empires. Religions replacing religions. Languages replacing languages. But it rarely accounts for what simply vanishes. Nalanda reminds us that knowledge is not immortal. It does not float above politics. It does not defend itself. It survives only when societies decide, actively, to protect it. This story is not about blame. It is about responsibility. Every generation inherits fragile systems. Every era assumes continuity. Every civilization believes its knowledge will endure. History disagrees. The silence left by Nalanda asks us something. What knowledge do we protect today? What institutions do we take for granted? What libraries, physical or digital, exist without defenders? Because destruction does not always arrive as fire and cavalry. Sometimes it arrives as neglect. Sometimes it arrives as indifference. Sometimes it arrives as silence. This has been Silent History. Not the history of what shouted the loudest, but the history of what disappeared quietly, and why remembering it still matters.